We are ultimately being influenced by psychopathic entities. That most medical research findings are false.
Man, that's a scary statement.
The greater the financial interests in a given field, the less likely the research findings are to be true.
And pharma is at the top of that list because of the money involved. It's that simple.
They're only able to sustain this system because of the lack of knowledge around this sort of stuff. They will deliberately try and suppress this information getting out, and that even means capturing media, capturing politicians, capturing regulators. This problem is bigger than a president, it's bigger than a prime minister.
You said when it comes to COVID vaccines and big pharma, the cover-up is now worse than the crime.
We have blindly accepted that if it's a vaccine, it must be safe and effective. All vaccines are clearly not the same.
You kind of breeze over some of these dark night of the soul moments that you've had. I mean, it can't be that easy when you're home alone in the dark thinking, do I really want to push forward with this? 6
anonymous NHS doctors, they are taking legal action against the General Medical Council for not investigating me. And yes, Brian, it is not easy. And there are times where I think, I could lose everything. Everything could just shatter tomorrow. When you come from a place where you know in your own heart that you are doing things that are for the good of your fellow human beings, for your patients, and you have a deep knowledge and understanding in a way that a lot of people don't understand yet and what's true, it's very empowering and it gives you a bit of a shield. And you're willing to accept whatever comes your way.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Aseem Malhotra, the award-winning cardiologist, public health campaigner, and author. You are considered one of the world's foremost experts on heart disease, obesity, and population health, and were named in the Sunday Times list of the most influential people in science and medicine in the UK. You've written 3 books, including the best-selling 21-Day Immunity Plan, The Piapi Diet, and A Statin-Free Life. And you've been a prominent advocate against the use of COVID vaccines and believe the mRNA product is the likely contributory factor in all unexpected cardiac arrests, heart attacks, strokes, arrhythmia, and heart failure since 2021. Ultimately, you believe we've had way too much medicine for too many years, and the real danger is that big pharma is now more powerful, profitable, and prolific than any time in history. Doctor, welcome to London Real.
Thank you for having me, Brian. Great to be here.
It's great to have you here. I'm going to go straight to a tweet that I think you sent out in the last 24 hours, and I think you said that when it comes to COVID vaccines and big pharma, the cover-up is now worse than the crime. And I know I'm probably dropping you right in the middle of this, but I feel like once we start, it'll probably, work its way out to find your whole path to coming here. But, 5 years ago, did you ever think that you might be tweeting something just like that?
No, definitely not. And certainly not anything in relation to vaccines. Brian, I have been involved in this campaign to try and change the system that ultimately harms patients because of medical misinformation, a lot of it driven by pharmaceutical industry for quite a long time. But I never thought I'd get to a stage where I'd be attacking any vaccine, to be honest. For me, vaccines are like the holy grail in medicine. I put them in a very special place. Something that, a phrase a lot of people would associate with, safe and effective. I swallowed that Kool-Aid. I still, to a large degree, do that for traditional vaccines, but certainly not this COVID vaccine, mRNA vaccine, absolutely not. And even not just that, even the AstraZeneca vaccine as well, which was effectively pulled in the summer of 2021 in most European countries because of these serious adverse effects on the cardiovascular system. So yeah, I never thought I'd be here.
You know, it's weird because I got an engineering degree from MIT, and I think because I was surrounded by science my whole life, and I was in science fairs when I was a kid, and I was a programmer, I kind of just trusted the science as opposed to maybe the application of that science, you know, in a legal way and in a safety way. And so coming into 2020, actually right when I interviewed Robert Kennedy in 2020, around in May, I was like, sign me up, I'm ready. I mean, vaccines have saved so many people and it's obviously a thing. And spending 90 minutes speaking to Robert Kennedy, and he walked me through, you know, the legislation from '86 and just all of these facts that I never thought about. I really had to think hard about something I'd kind of blindly trusted and assumed it was effective. It seems like so many people are that way about something like a vaccine.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at, and we could come on to the World Health Organization, I think there's issues with the WHO, which I think again have got worse in terms of their independence over the years. But you know, if you look at the if you go to the World Health Organization's website, they say that traditional vaccines are responsible globally for saving 4 to 5 million lives a year. And I think that probably has some validity, especially in the sort of more developing countries, you know, Africa, India, etc. But again, you know, I think we have blindly accepted that if it's a vaccine, it must be safe and effective. And I think we have to shift the conversation ultimately to saying, clearly this has been highlighted with COVID, all vaccines are clearly not the same. Rather than just being a black and white, I'm against vaccines, you know, I don't, you know, or I'm totally pro-vax. I think there's a middle ground here that we need to have a discussion on, a more nuanced discussion to get to the truth.
So you tweeted that today. If you could have the ears of 8 billion people in the world, like what would you like to say to them? Like right at this point in time, what's the most important thing to do? Is it to educate people on the dangers of this? Is it to stop all these COVID mRNA vaccines now for everybody until we know more? What do you think is the best thing to do?
Well, the current issue right now that we're facing is this, is the fact that this product has been delivered, pushed on millions, hundreds of millions of people, billions of people, if you like, around the world.
It's like 5.3 billion have gotten a vaccine.
Which is very poor in its efficacy and has very common, or certainly not rare, serious side effects. And I concluded at the end of last year when I published this paper, which I spent quite a long time writing and going through a very rigorous peer review process, that it should be suspended and probably now, with what we know, should never have been approved in the first place. But I think if we take a step back to try and understand the roots of this problem, Brian, I would say that the one thing that I would, you know, want everyone to know, and this may sound very controversial, but this comes from the person I call the Stephen Hawking of medicine, the most cited medical researcher in the world, John Ioannidis. If everybody just knew these few words to start with, you know, the barista in the coffee shop, the taxi driver, you know, the cleaner, the doctor, the nurse, if they knew from this position, they started from this position, that most medical research findings are false. If everybody knew that, then we could start to change the system for the better.
Man, that's a scary statement.
Yeah, well, that's from John Ioannidis and a paper he published in PLOS One in 2006. That was a title. In fact, it's the most downloaded research scientific paper in the history of medicine.
Most medical research findings are false.
Yeah.
Okay. How do we unpack that? Because most people, when they go to their doctors, they look to their doctors as if they're some almost like deities to a certain extent, you know, unerring. We trust our health to them, and we just assume that everything they conclude and write about is gospel. Well,
I think if we start from a position of, first of all, addressing this socio-cultural problem where many people believe incorrectly, including doctors, by the way, that medicine is an exact science like, say, physics or chemistry. And it's not. It never has been. It's an applied science. It's a science of human beings. It's a social science. It's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing as new information emerges. So if we start from that position, a lot of the way we make diagnosis or the way that we come to conclusions about what's at the root cause of a particular patient's presentation of symptoms or disease is it's the art of probabilities based upon information that we gather over time. So if we start from that place, then it's easier to unpack why Ioannidis would say most research published findings are false, because most of that research now is funded, analyzed, produced by drug companies who have a very specific legal obligation to produce profit for their shareholders and then not to give you the best treatment. Although we would believe, many people would believe that would be the case. And in that process, what they do invariably when they draw their conclusions, which are published in these journals like The Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine, is that almost always they will exaggerate the safety and benefits of their products in order to sell them. So that is how that concept is best understood. And one of the other things that John Ioannidis does, and he's also a mathematical genius. I think he got the national award in Greece for mathematics, actually. That's where he trained originally, and he went to medical school there. He also says, through his mathematical modeling analysis of trying to figure out what's reliable and what's not, or what is less reliable, he says the greater the financial interests or other prejudices in a given field, the less likely the research findings are to be true. Which is very interesting because, I know you, Brian, come from a kind of engineering and also a banking background, right? So if people think of technology and all the advancements that we've made in technology, which have been phenomenal in the last several hundred years, but certainly in the last few decades, we cannot apply that to medicine. But people do. They think that if it's an expensive drug, it must be really effective. But actually what I do and what a lot of the people in this space are trying to do is to try and say, listen, let's first and foremost understand what is the reliability of these research findings. What kind of data are we using here to make these conclusions? Ideally, we call it the hierarchy of evidence-based medicine tells us that the double-blinded randomized control trial is the highest quality level of evidence. But you actually ideally shouldn't be relying on one trial. You certainly shouldn't be you should be skeptical if it's sponsored by the drug industry, and then has it been replicated? And often the approval process doesn't allow us to get to a greater truth to understand that this information that we're getting, even from a randomized control trial, is reliable. And then is, okay, once we know there are limitations, which we should tell patients, right? That's part of actually the best way to practice medicine, is to also discuss uncertainties about anything you're telling a patient. Again, most doctors probably don't do this, we know that. So for me, I'm trying to be the best possible doctor I can be for my patients by understanding the information I'm using to the best level so that I can communicate that to patients in a way that they can understand, right? So for example, we look at statin drugs, one of the most prescribed lucrative drugs in the history of medicine, cholesterol-lowering drugs, estimated to be prescribed to up to maybe 1 billion people in the world, right? And we know that most people taking statins don't receive any benefit because the trials conducted by industry show that if you haven't had a heart attack, and these are most people who are prescribed statins, your absolute benefit of a statin at best over a 5-year period is 1 in 100 in preventing a non-fatal heart attack or non-disabling stroke. Yet most patients don't know this. Most doctors may not know it, and then they don't communicate it to patients. So we've got this biased decision-making process going on, which ultimately leads to an over-medicated population.
Right.
And really, once people understand that, everything else starts to fall into place. Or certainly they can then trace the roots of why we are where we are right now. To the extent where one estimate suggests the third most common cause of death after heart disease and cancer globally is prescribed medications, what your doctor prescribes for you.
Right. You probably didn't or shouldn't have taken anyways, and it killed you. You talk about the Vioxx settlement, and that was like maybe a way to show people about how here was a drug that was created. They knew there were going to be certain side effects, but it reminds me of that line from Fight Club, right? Where Edward Norton goes to look at the wrecked car and he said, it's simple. They take how much money it's going to make versus the probability of a settlement and how much the settlement's going to cost. If one number is bigger than the other, they go with the drug. Is it that simple? And do you use that Vioxx as an example of what the pharma industry does of a making money versus liability?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they see it as a cost of business. I think they go in trying to develop drugs that are going to be ideally of some benefit compared to a previous drug. But what often happens, Brian, in these trials is that harms start to come out, and we've seen historically that they have been aware that there are certain harms, with these drugs that can even kill people, like such as Vioxx, which ultimately was thought to be responsible for the deaths of maybe 60,000 Americans.
More than the Vietnam War.
And hundreds of thousands of heart attacks, right?
Right. More than the Vietnam War casualties.
Well, yes.
And yet most Americans probably don't even know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Merck knew, right? Their scientists knew that this was going to cause harm, but they, as legal entities, they were there to try and utilize the system to maximize profit, to try and hide the data on the harms, sell it as a really effective drug, better than ibuprofen. And ultimately it was found that was all found to be false, and they got fined close to $1 billion. But they end up making more profit from the sales of the drug, right? A lot more, so that they see it as a cost of business. And then nothing changes in the system to stop this happening again, and no one got fired, no one lost their job. They probably got promoted, I suspect, some of these people who are behind Vioxx. So when people understand that, and that's been going on for a very long time, then, you ask me, like, what do 8 billion people in the world need to know? They need to know this stuff, right? Because most people wouldn't find this acceptable. We live in democracies, and they're only able to sustain this system because of the lack of knowledge around this sort of stuff. But what they do is they will deliberately try and suppress this information getting out. And that even means capturing media, capturing politicians, capturing regulators. And I've come up with this term, which even Richard Horton referenced in The Lancet, because he came to my talk in London when I discussed all of these issues. The drivers at the root of this, or one of the main drivers at the root of many health problems going on in society today, even the suppression of democracy in many ways, is a psychopathic entity. So I call it the psychopathic determinants or drivers of ill health. Because the way that many of these multinational corporations make money is often behaving as legal entities in a psychopathic way. So callous unconcern for the safety of others, incapacity to experience guilt, deceiving people, deliberate lying, conning others for profit. So they tick all those boxes. So for me, I think that is something that people need to try and understand, because it also explains the cultural problems we're also facing right now.
Right, right.
Where we have people increasingly have less access to the truth. But also, Brian, we discussed this even before we started the show, I think the polarization of views around all of these things means that we are losing our capacity also for empathy. So for the human being, what it means to be human, this is not good, right? Losing access to the truth, being less empathetic. It's a recipe for chaos. It's a recipe for anarchy. It's a recipe for violence, verbal and physical violence. And that's my biggest concern, is that society is heading down that direction because we are ultimately being influenced by psychopathic entities.
And pharma is at the top of that list.
100%.
Because of the money involved. It's that simple.
Yeah. But if you take it further, it's the economic system that has allowed this to happen. Right. Maybe by stealth over time, they have behind the scenes, I talk about this increasing visible and invisible unchecked power. The invisible power is what they're doing behind the scenes, where they are influencing regulations. They are talking for, they use this term, which is propagandized about, we want small government, we don't want big government, because they are nanny state and they're interfering with our lives. They manipulate people through this sort of terminology. That comes from the corporations, right? I'm all for personal responsibility. I'm also for freedom of choice, 100%. But to exercise personal responsibility to make choices, you have to have knowledge, the right information, and you have to have choice. When it comes to things like, for example, obesity in the food environment, you also have to have access to healthy food, and it needs to be affordable. And if you don't have all those four, you can't exercise personal responsibility.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the ways that pharma projects power. I'm just going to guess a few off the top of my head and tell me if I'm right or wrong, or the ones that you think about. But I mean, in America, since you can advertise on television for a lot of these drugs, they seem to quote unquote own a lot of the networks because they pump so much advertising dollars, it feels like they can have an influence. That's one guess.
Yeah.
Secondly, campaign funding. I'm guessing donations to politicians, whether it's quid pro quo or not, to leave us alone. Agencies, which was kind of an eye-opener during the COVID case of whether it's the FDA or agencies here or the CDC or the NIH or whatever that's called, where they actually end up paying for a lot of the research, the salaries, et cetera. I'm sure I'm forgetting more. Yeah, I don't know, that's where I'm starting, where they have influence. And then I guess medical schools and funding of research. And those are things that are coming to the top of my head, and I probably don't even know the half. But
yeah, no, I think you've covered most of the main ones there, actually, Brian. So yeah, it's control of decision making, so lobbying politicians. And actually, I think, this is also an important area to discuss, because understandably, there is a lot of division right now around this whole issue about the vaccine. And there is certainly a subset of people who think there is some master plan or conspiracy to kill people, depopulation agenda, all this kind of stuff. I have, I'm very Socratic in my thinking as well, right? When Socrates said true wisdom only comes from dialogue. So as I've had the opportunity in my career with some of the work I've done to have access and have conversations with some of these people, some of these politicians who've been involved in government roles, former secretaries for health, for example, they come to me and ask me for medical advice. They trust me. And most of the time, a lot of their decision making is because of lobbying, a combination of ignorance and the illusion of knowledge, right? So, they genuinely believe what they're doing is based upon all the information they're being given, without really understanding that they're being lobbied by people who are presenting information to them as expert opinion, which is ultimately just biased information, which is propagated for the purposes of profiting these multinational corporations.
Okay.
So I think but you're right. So political environment, right? And we can see a great example of that. I'm glad you raised that point. We'll move on to others because it's quite relevant. When I started campaigning specifically on the COVID vaccine issue, was when they started to when Sajid Javid, our Secretary for Health, got up in Parliament towards the end of 2021 and said that we're going to now mandate the vaccine for healthcare workers. And I thought there's something odd. This doesn't make sense, because at the beginning we were told the narrative was this is only going to be offered to people at high risk. In fact, I was on Good Morning Britain because I took 2 doses of the jab and went on Good Morning Britain, not to kind of coerce people. I actually said, I understand why people are hesitant. I understand why, the rational concerns here. And it was specifically for ethnic minority groups at the time because they were more hesitant than others. But when they started bringing in the mandates, I thought, no, this doesn't make any sense. And ultimately, I spoke to somebody, we helped overturn, I was involved in a campaign to overturn the vaccine mandate for healthcare workers. So fine, that was a great victory for this movement. But ultimately, I recently met somebody I won't name, somebody who was in that government, very senior, who said to me explicitly, Aseem, I now realize the only people to benefit from the mandates of mandating the COVID vaccines were Big Pharma. This is a former government minister who was there at the time. So, and this person also said to me, I also now have a greater appreciation now. A lot of the policies that we passed were actually was influenced by commercial interests. So it's interesting that person is now awake. So
what does that tell you? That tells you that they didn't know it at the time, right? So they thought they were acting in the best interest of the politicians, of the people, and what they could do at the time. But now they have realized that actually this infects so much of government decision making?
I think they're slowly waking up. In terms of Sajid Javid as well, I'm sure he genuinely believed he was probably doing something that was the right thing. But I have no doubt that the tentacles, someone behind the scenes linked to Pharma was influencing him, right? And a lot of these politicians, they have this idea that, you know, we have to be friendly to industry. We have to support industry, right? Industry are the saviors of the economy. Industry ultimately have the solutions. And we know this is all false, ultimately. I'm sure there are great people within industry with great ideas, but the overall extra power that these industries have is actually causing damage to our democracy and our health now, whether it's big food or big pharma. And just on that point, again, in terms of conversations, several years ago, I'd been involved in this battle with sugar industry and targeting, you know, the obesity epidemic and blaming it on the collusion between government bodies. One particular is Public Health England, which has now changed the name, called it's called the National, I can't remember, something agency, I can't remember the name of it now, but it was formerly Public Health England. And the chief nutritionist, the former chief nutritionist of Public Health England, met me out of the blue in the street, actually, one day when I was walking in Hampstead. And we had been at loggerheads in the press, right? But was very pleasant to me. Actually, she said to me, Aseem, I'm very sorry about your mother's death, and because I've written about my mother dying. And ultimately, a lot of her problems with her health were influenced by bad food choices, ultra-processed food, addiction, actually. And we sat down, we had a conversation, and I said to her, okay, I understand there are these so-called diet wars going on, and nutritional science is not, you know, we talked about medical science and drug company sponsored studies being unreliable, but there's a lot of question marks over nutritional science as well. But I say, listen, at the very least, why on the healthy eating plate that you are part of, that you have influenced, the National Healthy Eating Guidance called the Eat Well Guide, why have you got junk food on there? Why is it in the corner, as well as this plate in terms of what should represent a healthy diet? You've got sugary drinks, you've got sodas, you've got potato chips, crisps, you've got cakes. And next to it, you said, eat less often and in small amounts. So it's a very vague kind of, but it's on the healthy eating guide. And also separate to that, we know that, you know, a publication by a nutrition researcher, a brilliant nutrition researcher called Zoe Harcombe in the British Journal of Sports Medicine showed that a significant proportion of the people influencing the guide when it was updated were people that worked for McDonald's and Coca-Cola and Pepsi. It's like, what are they doing influencing the healthy eating guidance, right? But when I said this to this person, the response in a very casual way was, Aseem, you've got to understand that one of the biggest contributors to our economy is the food industry. This is from a nutritional scientist supposed to be independent, influencing healthy eating guidelines. So the fact that they said that, for me, again, is another symptom, Brian, of the corporate capture of public health.
That's an odd thing to say. It's almost like when you go into the government, you're indoctrinated by saying, look, we are here to serve the corporations to a certain extent. And not necessarily being said, they're gonna pay our bills, but we're just saying that's why we're here. Okay. Like a doctor is supposed to look out for your health.
So it's what's happened. I think what's happened over time is that a lot of the people also, I think, that get into those positions, Brian, are the people that are going to be friendly to industry, right? Who have kind of just accepted this is the way things are. And again, I also think they have been blinded to understanding and looking at things longer term, not realizing properly that they are, you know, they may think that they can influence things in the right direction. And fine, we're going to get a bit of pushback, and ultimately we're still going to maybe make food healthier by slowly over years reducing the sugar content or reducing the salt or whatever else. But this is all ultimately just, you know, doesn't have any significant impact on population health. I think they see their roles as being like that, rather than saying, hold on a minute, actually, let's try and just tell people to completely eliminate ultra-processed food from their diet, right? And treat these sorts of foods like we did tobacco. I think that's where we're going with this ultimately. Those are the solutions. We need some real sort of clear-cut, strong people to stand up and say, enough is enough. We can't be your puppets any longer.
How much of it is it that they're thinking in the longer term, later on in their careers, they might be significantly paid by some of these corporations. I think, or if you're in an agency as well, like the FDA, the CDC, whether that's conscious or subconscious. But
I think we're being polite. But I think you're right. We know, for example, that so we talk about, for example, one of the big issues is the capture of the regulators. So I was in Australia recently, and a senior journalist on Sky News Australia called Rowan Dean, he was shocked when I said in the interview that the 96% of the funding of the Australian medical regulator, the TGA, comes from Pharma. And he initially didn't believe me. And I was like, no, this is factually correct. This is published in the British Medical Journal, an investigation actually done by an Australian journalist called Marion Damasi. 65% of the funding of the FDA comes from Pharma. 86% of the funding in this country of the regulator comes from Pharma. 86% of the MHRA. And the chair of the BMA, Char Nagpur, when I gave a lecture during the British Medical Association Island Conference last year, at one of their fringe meetings, and he was there, and the president of the BMA was there, he was gobsmacked. He actually didn't believe me initially. He didn't even know that, the chair of the BMA. So that tells you that the ignorance or misinformation or illusion of knowledge, one or all of those three ways of thinking, is at the very highest levels of medical leadership, of policy making. Right. So I think it's important to know that, because, listen, there are nefarious people out there. Right, there are generally some very bad actors, but I think more than that, I think the system encourages good people to do bad things. But once they are presented with the information and the facts, they are more likely to then act on it and realize, hold on a minute, this isn't right. But I think what's happened with these big corporations is they've captured so many people that this problem is bigger than any one person. It's bigger than a president. Is bigger than a prime minister. I realized that several years ago and attempted on at least 3 occasions and I broke the mainstream, saying we need a public inquiry into the pharmaceutical industry and their influence over clinical decision making, which is very harmful, on a scale that we had like the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War. And I wrote about this, and it became news stories in the Daily Mail, in the Guardian. It was a front page of the newspaper when I went and spoke in the European Parliament in 2018. And the title of the talk was "Big Food and Big Pharma Killing for Profit?" ? And I went there with the former president of the Royal College of Physicians, Sir Richard Thompson, who was also former personal physician to the Queen of England, who was all very much on side. And the reason I did that, Brian, was because I thought this problem is so big that it needs like huge awareness, ideally through the mainstream media. And that also influences politicians to act. I found that that's how it worked with my campaign on ultimately helping bring about the tax on sugary drinks and raising awareness on the harms of sugar, which I did in that same way. And I thought, and I tried several times, I kept, and I went and met with politicians and discussed it with them, even the then chair of the Health Select Committee, Sarah Wollaston. And I sat with her in her room, and then she realized this was a big problem several years ago. Like, this was a really big issue, because what was also going on is lots of examples of research misconduct were coming out, fabrication of data across British institutions, and nothing was done to sort the problem out. And we thought, bloody hell, this is just really, really bad. But she even said to me, Aseem, I need more support from my colleagues. The colleagues, a lot of those politicians respond to the media, right? Because they know the media influence the public. Yeah. Right, so this is how it all works. So this is what we call the triangle that moves a mountain. So this is how we need to change the system, is understand that triangle, which is create the relevant information that's clear, concrete, strengthen that information towards a greater truth, disseminate it to the public, social movement, and that can be through alternative media, social media, more and more now. Mainstream media, ideally, that's traditionally what's been most effective and still is very effective, unfortunately, right now. And then get the political engagement. Because we need to work with the politicians, because ultimately they have the power to determine the laws that are going to strengthen democracy and protect the public from the now clear excesses and manipulations of these multinational corporations that are damaging people's mental health, physical health, social well-being, and democracy.
While we're on government, Matt Hancock posted a video recently, or you posted on your Twitter, of him apologizing, I think, under was it a deposition or something? And he was the health secretary during COVID.
Part of the COVID inquiry, yes.
Right, COVID inquiry.
Giving evidence on that.
You tweeted about it. What was your comment on that, and what is your thought on that? And what was your thought on his handling of the crisis, or even the government at the time?
It's interesting. So I have met Matt. I've known him at a reasonable level, partly because a few years ago, I'm just trying to remember the timeline here. So 2019, I gave a talk in the British Parliament, organised by at that time the MP was Keith Vaz, and he was the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on diabetes. A lot of my work has been propagating information on how people can send their type 2 diabetes into remission purely from dietary changes, right? So, and because my first book had become quite successful, and I'd done a documentary film called The Big Fat Fix that had influenced the deputy leader of the Labour Party at that time, Tom Watson, to lose 100 pounds, and that got publicised. They knew also, because of my research work and everything I published, that I was a credible person to talk about this. So I was invited to speak in Parliament, and Tom Watson also was quite friendly with Matt Hancock, who was Secretary for Health, and I got in touch with him as well through that. And Matt was initially supposed to come to my talk, but couldn't make it and said, let's meet beforehand. So I met Matt before that, gave him a copy of my book. And I think later on he mentioned, I think, that he lost 2 stones probably on that diet plan himself. So we had initial rapport and interaction then. And then during the pandemic, I was very vocal early on, Brian, on making the link between obesity and metabolic health problems, conditions related to excess body fat and worse COVID outcomes. In fact, I went on Sky News in March 2020 to say, you know, Boris has come out with this slogan, you know, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, but actually he should put in there, eat real food.
Right.
Because actually we know very quickly you can send a lot of these risk factors associated with COVID and reverse them or optimize them just within a few weeks of changing diet. And in fact, that would probably have a big impact on the resilience to infection. And I was getting livid about it because it was so clear the link.
Did it frustrate you in that?
It did, but you know, and I tried several times, and I eventually got articles in newspapers. I published in journals. I wrote this article, which ended up being a front page, featured as a front page commentary in the Daily Telegraph. You know, and suddenly then I was on BBC News and I was on Good Morning Britain. I've done several stuff, you know, with them before. And I said, I wrote about this, Boris Johnson probably got sick and got hospitalized with COVID because of his weight, you know. And that became a massive story, and we got this stuff into the mainstream. Certainly it was one day's news, and it carried on for a little while. And it was that time Matt then reached out to me again, had an email exchange, and he asked me to advise him on the link between COVID and obesity. And I said, Matt, to be honest, this has been going on for such a long time. You need to introduce policy changes that really address ultra-processed food consumption, which is half of the calories in British diet. You know, these are essentially foods that are high in sugar, refined carbs, unhealthy oils. All the studies point in one direction, that they cause harm, even independent of body weight, right? These are observational studies, fine, they have their limitations, but there's no study showing a benefit. And clearly we know that the food industry manipulate and engineer foods to make them addictive. So this is a low-hanging fruit like big tobacco. You need to introduce policies to address this, you know, ban advertising of these foods, you know, tax ultra-processed foods, public health education campaign, of course, right? So I told him all that stuff. So we had an interaction there. But moving forward, of course, you know, all these WhatsApp messages came out. That was again on the front page of the Telegraph that he had this plan to frighten the pants off the public around COVID. And the reason, coming back to the tweet, the reason I was a little bit alarmed by what he'd said in the COVID inquiries, he was now going down the route of, we should have locked down earlier. We should have been more stringent and locked down earlier. And
is that what he's saying now?
Yeah, that's why my tweet was something along the lines of, good Lord.
Right.
That was it, right? But I was, you know, we know that lockdowns didn't work, right? They were never really going to stop the spread. They would delay things for a while, but we know even in Australia now, you know, their mortality statistics from COVID, even though they kept it at bay for a very, very long time, were as high as anywhere else. It had a very minimal impact on reducing COVID deaths, but with all the collateral damage, I think it's a very reasonable argument to be made that it did more harm than good, for sure.
Yeah.
So I don't think that was the thing that I was a bit surprised that Matt was saying.
Right. Sounds like a weird deflection. So walk me through the last 3 years then. And what was going through your mind starting in March 2020 and maybe coming up to now, because a lot of things happened, and your thoughts on the government's reaction?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, with everything I had worked on and campaigned on in my area of research and my interest in diet-related disease, we had a fast pandemic with COVID that exploited a slow pandemic of chronic disease, right? And one clear stat, which is important for people to understand all of that, is that 90% of the deaths globally from COVID now happened in countries where more than half the population were overweight or obese. So clear link there, and it's not I told you so, but if we had actually reversed the obesity epidemic or type 2 diabetes epidemic, something I've been campaigning on for a decade, through policy changes, through right education, through controlling misinformation on diet, then we probably wouldn't have suffered the death toll that we did. At the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge, not to undermine, certainly early on, COVID was particularly devastating for elderly and vulnerable groups. Infection fatality rate was several times higher than the flu. I think now when we look back, I think for people under 70, John Ioannidis actually published a paper on this, saying that the infection fatality rate in people under 70 was actually probably similar to the flu, which is reassuring. But yes, I even managed some patients with long COVID who are still struggling. So, it definitely was a novel virus. In fact, on that note, Brian, as well, I know you've spoken to many different people on this. Something I learned recently is, so when I was in Australia, I spent a day with, in fact, I stayed at his house, a gentleman who's considered one of Australia's most eminent immunologists. His name's Nick Petrovsky. Nick was the first scientist in the world to publicly to discover that the COVID virus came from a lab. It wasn't from a wet market. It had been engineered or manipulated by humans, right? And Nick was that guy. So I spent some time with Nick, and it was very interesting speaking to him about this, because I know people have all sorts of different theories, and this gain of function research, I'm sure you have your own ideas on this, which up until I spoke to Nick, no one had properly been able to explain to me. I'd spoke to Robert Malone about this as well. Like, what exactly is going on here? Is it scientists trying to get ahead of the curve, take viruses, coronaviruses, manipulate them a little bit to try and see how they can become more pathogenic or virulent, and then can we then do something to protect ourselves from this if this was to ever, be circulated widely in the population by producing vaccines? That sounds like a plausible explanation. But actually, it's interesting, that isn't the reason why gain-of-function research occurs, certainly according to Nick. And this may sound strange, what I'm about to tell you, but I can kind of understand this. It's done for purposes of just curiosity and interest amongst many of these scientists. You can say for fun. That may sound odd. I know that coming from an interventional cardiology background, I trained in keyhole heart surgery effectively. Surgeons, interventional cardiologists like to operate, right? Let's use this word. It is fun. It may sound, now listen, I'm not saying it's right. And of course, it's good that people enjoy what they do, but often if they're doing that at the expense of patients, that isn't right. So in some senses, there was that similar kind of mindset amongst, I think, some of these scientists. So they were doing this sort of work, and it had been one of the previous presidents in the US had defunded gain-of-function research in the US.
They made it illegal. Didn't Obama make it illegal?
Yeah.
And it was given an exception because it was previously funded.
And I understand, and I understand that Fauci, right, basically was part of all of this. I think wasn't happy. I think went to the military. The military didn't want to engage in it because they thought it was too risky. Absolutely. Like, why would you do this? Because of course things can go wrong. And then ultimately there was this joint American-Chinese lab in Wuhan. I think, listen, conspiracies can happen. They can come true. I like to look at things to see if is there a more rational explanation. Often a lot of these things are cock-ups. And I think that school of thought has, it sounded very plausible to me that this escaped, and then of course the powers that be wanted to cover that up because it's embarrassing. But they should have been honest with people, I think. And anyway, so we move forward.
Yeah, it's just wild because we were talking about this in, say, June of 2020 and July, and Plandemic 2 is based on this whole thing. And I mean, I was getting thrown off of YouTube for questioning masks or social distancing, let alone you don't want to use the V.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.
So Jim Rickards has just recorded a video that's not available to anyone in the public, and he's going to be talking about how this upcoming recession is going to be fast, it's going to be bloody, it's going to be nasty. But at the same time, he's going to show you how you can position yourself to profit from all of this chaos. Now, we've made this video only available to our viewers. Go to londonreal.tv/Jim. Watch that immediately. I can't say enough good things about Jim Rickards. He understands the global economic system better than any guest I've ever had on London Real. His predictions are almost uncannily true, and you can learn how to profit from his vision, from his expertise, and his understanding of economics. So go to londonreal.tv/Jim or click the link below. It's an excellent, excellent look on what's going to happen in the future and how you can position yourself to profit from that. Jim is one of the best in the business, one of my favorite guests on London Real, and he's very, very good at predicting the future and showing us all to profit from it. So click the link, and I hope you enjoy. Hey, it's Brian Rose, founder of the DeFi Academy. I've told you my 4-week crypto bootcamp is amazing, but don't take my word for it. This is what my students are saying.
The DeFi Academy was an amazing experience for me. It took me totally out of my comfort zone.
In this course, I was challenged, I was held accountable, and pushed to do things that honestly weren't always easy.
It's been phenomenal, and I can't believe we're already up on our 4 weeks. It has flown by.
Going through this DeFi accelerator by far was one of the best courses I've taken.
You do this course, you really get into the nitty-gritty of the activities that will make you comfortable with decentralized finance.
Thank you so much to Brian and everyone at London Real and the DeFi Academy for even putting together an amazing course like this.
Anybody else that wants to do it, please sign up. It is well worth the money.